Hey, what's up guys? So I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I've tried to make a video about this something like 6 times in the last 6 weeks, but it's a really complicated issue and it's just been hard to find the exact right words to articulate my thoughts fully. I suspect this will be an ongoing conversation, which I'd love to have with you all in the comments below, or on my Discord server, or on my Twitch stream. I've put a lot of thought into this, but it's going to come out as sort of a bit of a video essay, so just bear with me. Let's start with this. How are you guys feeling about Escape from Tarkov lately? And I don't mean in terms of like bugs or desync or hackers or whatever. For the sake of argument, ignore that stuff for this conversation. Those of you who've been around for a couple wipes now are probably familiar with what a lot of people in the community refer to as the wipe cycle. Basically, by the end of a wipe, a huge portion of the player base has dropped out, only to come all rushing back for the new wipe, which feels amazing and fresh for a few days to a couple of weeks, and then pretty quickly people start dropping out again. They always come back for each new wipe, but it's like they only feel engaged by those early wipe days. If you've only started playing Tarkov this year, you might not have noticed it yet, but if you stick with it, you probably will. In fact, there's a good chance it'll happen to you, and you'll experience it firsthand. Now, if you have noticed it, why do you think that is? What is it about those first few days after a wipe that makes the game so exciting, that brings so many people back to Tarkov? And what is it that causes that feeling to go away only to come back with each new wipe? What is it about the game that makes it so that we can't hold on to that feeling without wiping everything over and over and over again? I've heard a lot of theories, both from the community and from my fellow content creators on Twitch and YouTube. And while it seems like a lot of people are feeling like Tarkov has a problem with sustaining long-term interest, nobody can seem to quite agree with what the cause is. Pestily said recently that he feels like even though there's a lot more quality content in Tarkov these days, he actually used to enjoy the game a lot more a couple of years ago when it felt like combat was more interesting and it wasn't just everyone running around with the same weapons machine gunning each other down in a quarter of a second. A lot of people seem to think that the game needs more quests and endgame content. Others think that the problem is we need more maps or new weapons and gear. I was talking to Veritas on his stream a while ago, and he suggested that Tarkov needs a more robust RPG-like character creation or skill system, allowing everyone to make wildly different characters from one another, which will enable people to play the game multiple times and have very different experiences each time. Like how in Skyrim, for instance, you might play a thiefy assassin type one playthrough, then a buff soldiery guy next, and then a wizard a third time. Tweak recently suggested in a video that the game needs to lock out labs in reserve until you hit some specific level, and maybe even set level caps shortly after a wipe to prevent no-lifers and streamers and whatever from hitting max level 2 days after the wipe. A lot of people have been suggesting enabling a prestige system too. A lot of these ideas have merit, and I think they would make great additions to the game, but I don't think they'd solve Tarkov's core problem. They might move the finish line a bit further down the track, but I suspect not very far. So what is that core problem exactly? Well, for about a month before the end of last wipe, I was actually starting to feel pretty fatigued with Tarkov. I was level 40, but I hadn't even finished half the tasks, so there was still plenty to do. But my hideout was fully upgraded, which meant I was bringing in a steady amount of money every day without even going into raids. And the Flea Market gave me access to literally anything I might want. There was no pain if I died, which meant there were no stakes. Is Tarkov without pain really Tarkov? I figured once the wipe hit, this would go away, and it did. Suddenly everyone is wielding pistols and baby AKs with bad ammo and little to no armor, and every fight felt really scrappy and interesting. You know what it is? It felt appropriately post-apocalyptic to me. Finding a fucking Vepr Hunter was like finding gold. Finding a handful of quality ammo was reason enough to send your heart racing and make you want to extract as fast as possible. Looting felt meaningful. The fights were varied. I felt more engaged with the game than I had since the start of the last wipe. This feeling lasted about 2 days. I was broke, and while my inventory was full, it was all pretty weak gear and some barter goods. I'd been struggling a lot, and while it was frustrating in that good way that only Tarkov can make you feel. It was the good frustration that would bring about a lot of joy when I reached some successes. But then I hit level 10 and I got access to the Flea Market, and instantly I was able to sell my barter goods and went from like 4,000 rubles to over 2 million instantaneously. I was able to upgrade everything in my hideout to at least level 1 and half of it to level 2. And now, because I had the Flea Market, I had access to literally everything in the game. Maybe I can't afford it all, but there would never be a reason for me to pick up a crappy weapon ever again. I'd always be able to afford something at least halfway decent. Probably half the equipment in the game became obsolete to me as items I'd never bother picking up again, let alone use. The feeling of being in the apocalypse where scavenging actually meant something was completely gone. The whole game was now about economics, and looting was about finding things with the most value per square of inventory space. It makes no sense to pick up an insanely decked out gun that I would love to use that's worth 150,000 rubles if it takes up 8 inventory slots when I could fill those 8 squares up with useless dry fuel worth more than 150k per square. An item's usefulness to me means nothing now. Everything is about what it's worth on the flea market, because if you get the most monetary value for your raid, you'll be able to fund future raids, ensuring you always go in with the most meta gear possible. There's just something about the way money turns everything into an abstraction that takes so much away from that feeling of Tarkov. So yeah, I hit level 10 and I pretty much instantly lost interest in the game, and I love this game. I'm not even very good at it, but no other game makes me feel like Tarkov can, and I just feel like every new feature introduced to Tarkov makes it a little easier and waters down that core vision. And it seems to me like whether we're able to articulate exactly what it is or not, I'm not alone in feeling this way. Even listening to Nikita, it seems like he feels like the game is too easy, but also feels like he can't roll things back to make it harder and more in line with his vision because the community will rage out over it. But it's that same community that starts dropping out of the game shortly after a new wipe, only to come back every future wipe. It's like we all know when Tarkov is at its most interesting, but nobody's quite sure how to permanently capture that feeling. And I don't think any amount of new maps, guns, or quests will restore that early wipe feeling. Some people have suggested that even once the game is fully released, it's going to need regular wipes to maintain interest. This seems like a terrible idea to me and basically suggests that there's something seriously wrong with Tarkov that it would need this so often. Even Veritas's idea of giving players a reason to do multiple playthroughs through a much more diverse character class system or skill system or whatever, while it sounds awesome and I would love to have it in the game, I don't think it would fix anything because I don't even know how many people maintain interest in the game long enough to even get through one full playthrough. The same would go for prestige systems and new quests and any other idea you might have to delay boredom with extra content without addressing this core issue of the game. Okay, so I've gone on long enough talking about what I think the problem is. How do we solve it? Well, I can tell you my ideas, but frankly, you're not going to like them. It would involve removing multiple features from the game that I think the community has come to rely on like a crutch and would freak out if they were removed, even if it's better for the game that they are. So before you bring out your pitchforks and call me a filthy no-life streamer who doesn't know the plight of a man with 6 kids and 4 jobs and only 1 hour a year to play, I want to remind you guys that while I do stream and make videos for Tarkov, I'm not exactly god tier at this. I'm pretty average. I only play it a few times a week on stream. Most of you are probably vastly more successful at the game than I am. I don't want these changes because I'm so good at the game that I selfishly want more of a challenge. I think that there are deep issues affecting the long-term viability of the game, and I want to see it do well because I do love this game. That said, let me know your thoughts in the comments, whether you think I'm right or wrong about any of this. So to me, it all comes down to scarcity. Whenever I imagine a post-apocalypse scenario, at its core, it always comes down to that feeling of fighting over the last scraps of resources. Digging out an old shotgun shell from underneath a gun cabinet that the last band of raiders missed, or having just 2 bullets in your old revolver and having to make do with it. I'm not suggesting Tarkov needs to go quite that far with it, but I do think there's a version of this in the core vision of the game that the game's gotten very far away from. And I just don't think you can ever get that core vision back without reintroducing scarcity in a major way. Scarcity is what creates that feeling of exhilaration when you find something really valuable, and it's what creates that devastation when you lose it. Right now, unless you're brand new, Tarkov really only creates this feeling with a few items, and so you don't experience it very often. And most of the time, they're keys that once you get them, you just stuff them into your secure container, and you're never at risk of losing them ever again. So the more you play, the less and less you're going to have those great feelings of finding amazing loot. And you almost never experience devastation if you die, since you can easily replace almost everything in the game. There are 2 main things destroying the feeling of scarcity. The first is the flea market, which I think should be completely removed from the game. There's no level you can lock it behind where it would eventually become okay to have in the game. The second you get access to it, a massive chunk of the difficulty of the game gets removed. Having a player-driven economy is a great thought, and I respect what Nikita and BSG were going for with it, but in my opinion, it undermines the entire game and should be removed. But it's not enough to just remove it. We haven't always had the flea market, but Tarkov has always had this feeling of growing stale over time. It just used to take much longer. The other big problem, I think, has to do with traders. I'll give you an example. At the start of a wipe, you're sort of forced to bring in AI2 medkits and basic bandages, and because of how limited they are in function, you wind up bringing in 2 of each and you still don't feel very good about it. But as soon as you complete Therapist's second quest, you get access to the car first aid kit, which by itself both heals damage and stops bleeding, so it does the job of both those previous items, does it better, and does it in half the inventory space. And it's cheaper too. So as soon as you get access to them, there's almost no reason to ever use normal bandages or AI2s ever again. The same thing happens once you get access to the Salewas and IFAKs. The same is true of splints. It's true of a lot of items in the game. You just get to a certain point where there's just never a reason to use certain armors, ammo types, guns, and basically half the items in the game. But why should this ever be the case though? In a game meant to feel at least somewhat post-apocalyptic, why should an upgraded item ever feel like it's the standard? Why should we ever get to the point where 90% of the gear in this game becomes so obsolete and useless that not only would you not use it, but you wouldn't even loot it? What if we flip that? What if we flip that and instead the most basic of items feel vital? And if you manage to get something better, that feels like an incredibly valuable treat worth coveting. This is the problem with the traders, especially as you max them out. They create a new norm where leveling up means you create a new baseline that you'll never really have to go under, which by its very nature is going to create that feeling of an established meta that starts to bore most of the player base, causing a lot of them to drop out and makes nearly everyone eager for a new wipe. So what if we got rid of the traders? I mean, sure, there should be task givers, and they could give you rewards still, but why is it necessary for quest givers to also be fucking shopkeepers? And I get it, most of you are recoiling and sharpening your pitchforks, but just think about it for a second. What if the only way to get new equipment was by actually scavenging it in raid? Suddenly a lot more ammunition becomes viable, as a lot of people will be forced to use crappy armor, or really good but damaged armor. Finding anything of quality will create very high highs, and losing them will cause very low lows, but these won't be rare events, they'll happen almost every raid. Every time you play will be a roller coaster ride of emotions. This is the way I think Tarkov was originally envisioned to be. With true scarcity, you're no longer picking up gear based on its arbitrary monetary value, but instead based on its utility. Its personal utility to you. Food and water mechanics actually become more meaningful instead of what it is now, just a pain in the ass to remember to fill up before each raid. Same for post-raid injuries. I don't even understand why we have to heal after each raid now, except as an incredibly minor money sink, and again, mostly just a pain in the ass. But if items were scarce, then you might actually be forced to go into future raids already injured, which will affect your playstyle, making you treat your life with more care. You might actually have to go into raids just for the explicit purpose of finding food, water, and medicine, and other basic items, instead of what Tarkov is right now, basically a money farming exercise with a lot of the same beats and rhythms every single time. Going up against large groups when you're solo will no longer feel like an impossible task, as you won't have to kill 4 or 5 guys armed to the teeth who can basically blow through your armor and kill you in a quarter of a second. Most likely they'll have wildly different weapons and armor, making the time to kill in these situations higher and giving you a better chance if you're better skilled, instead of what it is now, where a lot of the times it feels impossible to get out of those situations in one piece because everyone you run into has a 60-round mag and it'll only take them 3 shots to kill you through your slick armor. And if you're brand new coming into Tarkov months after a wipe, you won't feel like the whole game is a massive uphill climb because you're late. Instead of the entire player base having unlocked everything while you're still forced to deal with level 1 traders and no flea market and basically unable to shoot through people's armor and not really understanding what's going on because you're new at the game, now even at level 1 you'll find yourself in pretty much even footing with the rest of the player base. Both player and character skills will still be a factor to help give people a leg up over each other, and the more you play, the more likely you are to accumulate better gear, but it's much less likely to result in every raid feeling like everyone is always maxed out. All the fights will be more varied and more interesting with a wider variety of loot. Weapon balance becomes less important as rarity has its own balancing effect. Nikita's been talking about weapon condition causing jams and barrel warping in the future, but I can already tell this is going to be a completely useless game mechanic in the current climate. If you know you have a gun in low condition, you're just going to repair it or replace it. It'll be a small blip on your radar and just one more annoyance for us to keep track of, but not something that will actually affect us because weapons will be so readily available on the flea market or through the traders. He's even talking about traders selling you guns with random condition values, but all this is going to do is cause us to use the traders less and the flea market more, or sell bad items and try to get good ones instead. Meaningless inconveniences and nothing more. But imagine if scarcity was a real factor. Now you might have to actually use a good gun in poor condition because you don't have access to any others. Or if you're worried about its condition and can't repair it, you might downgrade to a worse gun instead. Now you're making meaningful choices, and because you won't have an infinite supply of everything through the flea market, guns are more likely to actually degrade because they'll really be passed around and not simply discarded because of low condition. So yeah, there's a lot more nuance that can go into all this, but that's the basic idea. Get rid of traders and the flea market and we'll create real scarcity in the game, which I think will solve a ton of problems in the game and also permanently create that feeling of the first day of a new wipe. But what do you guys think? If you disagree, let me know what you think the solution is. I don't think we can deny that players drop out of Tarkov in huge numbers only to come back at the start of every wipe. So how do we solve that problem in the long term? It can't just be with new maps. Even prestige mode only works for the small number of players who play the game often enough to get to that point, which I doubt is a very high percentage. How do you keep the meta from getting stale when it's so easy to get your hands on everything in the game? Found and Raid has done nothing to solve this problem. It really only helps defend against hackers and hatchling farmers. So what do you think the solution is, if not this? For my part, I'm doing a little experiment and I'm sort of putting my money where my mouth is, and I'm doing what I'm calling the Ultimate Apocalypse Challenge. Basically, I'm taking away just about every convenience the game provides to make it as close to a true post-apocalypse game as I can. No flea market, no traders, no insurance, no secure container, no free stuff, no teaming, no scav runs, and a bunch of other stuff too. It's going to be super punishing and super difficult. A lot of people in my Discord server are calling this unplayable, but so far I'm actually finding myself more engaged with Tarkov than I ever have been in the past. In fact, everything you've seen in this video has been from my first day of this challenge. I'm going to be playing this challenge run exclusively for the foreseeable future. If you're curious about it, come check me out on Twitch where I'll be broadcasting every second of the challenge run. And if you want to see me chronicle my adventures with this challenge run on YouTube, let me know and I'll think about doing a series. I'm hoping with this challenge run I'll get some unique insight into how the game can be played and whether or not it's fun to play this way. I know a lot of people would dismiss my ideas out of hand, and that without testing them, that might actually be deserved. So I'm testing them. The only issue is the deck is sort of stacked against me since the rest of the player base is still going to be using the flea market and everything else. So I'm at a huge disadvantage, which is going to make this a lot more punishing than it would be if everyone were playing this way, but I still think it'll be interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, guys. You can get all my links in the description below, along with the more detailed list of rules for this challenge. Have a good one, guys. We'll see you next time.